4 walls, 3 empires, one battle that nearly erased Egypt's name from the ancient world for good. 100,000 soldiers clashed at Kadesh in 1274 BC in the largest chariot engagement the ancient world had ever witnessed. Egypt's most celebrated pharaoh then carved his version of that battle across 4 temples stretching hundreds of miles along the Nile. But in 1906, archaeologists cracked open the Hittite royal archive and found a completely different account of the exact same war. The official Egyptian record claimed a magnificent, crushing, total victory over the Hittite Empire in the desert of Syria. The Hittite record described the same day as a near capture of the Egyptian pharaoh and a humiliating collapse of his forward divisions. Both versions were carved in stone. Both were meant to last forever, and only one of them was telling the truth. 3,000 years later, the ground beneath Kadesh and the walls of 4 Egyptian temples are still giving up secrets that no pharaoh ever intended to survive. Here is the secret hidden in plain sight on the walls of Egypt's greatest temples. These carvings were not neutral memories. They were public verdicts, carved for people who needed to believe that the pharaoh had mastered chaos. Every charging horse, every falling enemy, every calm king in the center of battle was part of a message. The message said Egypt had not trembled, the gods had not failed, and the king had not been saved by luck. That is why the 4 walls in this story matter so much. They do not simply show battles. They show how power edits disaster until it looks like destiny. Karnak created the language. The Ramesseum turned that language into a national myth. Abu Simbel revised the myth until no trace of doubt remained. Medinet Habu repeated the same grammar of triumph while the Bronze Age world was collapsing around Egypt's borders. In ancient Egypt, a temple wall was more than decoration. It was a political instrument built from stone, religion, and royal authority. A painted scroll could burn, a witness could die, and an army could remember the truth badly. But a wall in a sacred temple could stand for thousands of years, repeating the king's version to every priest, pilgrim, official, and subject who passed beneath it. The wall did not need to tell everything. In fact, its power came from deciding what could not be shown. A pharaoh could be surrounded, delayed, deceived, or forced into a treaty, but the wall could not present him as uncertain. The wall had one duty: to turn events into order. If reality was messy, the carving made it clean. If victory was partial, the carving made it complete. The first wall stands at Karnak, the vast temple complex of Luxor, where New Kingdom kings wrote their power into stone on a scale no visitor could ignore. On the northern exterior wall of the great hypostyle hall, Thutmose III recorded campaigns that stretched from Nubia to Syria. He appears enormous, controlled, and almost effortless, while the enemies beneath him appear small enough to be held by the hair. This was the template. The pharaoh is large, the enemy is small. The result is total. The message is not that a difficult campaign was managed with risk and discipline. The message is that Egypt's king naturally defeats every threat placed before him. Once that visual language existed, later, pharaohs did not need to invent propaganda from nothing. They only needed to step into the pose and carve their own names beside it. Karnak tells the story of Megiddo as a clean triumph. Thutmose III marches through a dangerous pass, surprises a Canaanite coalition, and wins by courage where cautious generals feared disaster. The image is powerful because it gives the audience exactly what empire always wants from its past: A king who sees clearly, acts boldly, and makes history obey him in a single decisive afternoon. But the details underneath the triumph are harder to control. After the enemy line broke, Egyptian soldiers stopped to loot the abandoned camp instead of completing the pursuit. The defeated leaders escaped behind the walls of Megiddo, and the quick victory became a long siege. What the public wall compresses into royal certainty, the fuller record stretches into months of pressure, hunger, negotiation, and unfinished danger. That omission matters because it teaches us how the system worked. Karnak did not need to invent a victory from nothing. Egypt really did win at Megiddo, and Thutmose III really did expand Egyptian power. The deception was subtler and more useful than a simple lie. It took a difficult victory, cut away the delay, removed the embarrassment, and left the public with a polished image of total control. That image became dangerous because later kings inherited it as an expectation. If Thutmose could be shown winning cleanly, then every great pharaoh after him had to be shown doing the same. The wall became a standard that reality was forced to meet after the fact. 2 centuries later, Ramesses II would face a battle far messier than Megiddo, and he would need the old language of Karnak more than any king before him. The second wall stands at the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple Ramesses II built for himself on the west bank of the Nile. Here, the Battle of Kadesh was carved with a scale and confidence that still overwhelms the eye. Ramesses appears in his chariot, alone amid the storm, larger than danger itself. Enemies fall, horses twist, arrows fly, and the king remains calm inside the chaos. This is not merely a battle scene. It is a rescue operation for royal memory. Kadesh had not gone the way Egypt expected. The campaign was supposed to break Hittite power in Syria and secure the city for Egypt. Instead, it became one of the most famous command failures of the ancient world. So the wall did what Egyptian walls had been trained to do. It took a near disaster and rebuilt it as a miracle. The disaster began with false intelligence. Two men captured by the Egyptians told Ramesses that the Hittite army was far away, still north of Kadesh. Ramesses believed them and moved ahead with the Amun division, leaving the rest of his army stretched behind him on the road. It was the exact mistake an enemy commander dreams of creating. The truth came too late. More captured Hittite soldiers revealed that the first informants had been planted and the Hittite army was hidden nearby. Then the trap closed. Hittite chariots smashed into the Ra division before it could form, scattered the Egyptian line, and drove panicked survivors toward the royal camp. The king, who would later appear as a calm god on the wall, was suddenly in real danger. At the center of the crisis, Ramesses II was isolated near his camp, while Hittite forces surged into the Egyptian position. The official version says he called upon Amun, found divine strength, charged alone into the enemy, and broke the encirclement by sheer courage. It is one of the most dramatic royal claims in the ancient record, and that drama is exactly why it had to be carved so many times. What the wall cannot admit is that the battle was not decided by divine loneliness. Egyptian reinforcements arrived. The Hittite chariots became disorganized after entering the camp, and both armies survived the day, with neither side achieving the clean victory it wanted. Kadesh remained outside Egyptian control. Ramesses lived, but living was not the same as winning. For centuries, the Egyptian version dominated because it was the version carved in stone. Then, archaeologists working at Hattusa, the Hittite capital in modern Turkey, recovered clay tablets from the royal archive. Those tablets preserved another imperial memory of the same conflict. Suddenly, the Egyptian wall was no longer alone in the courtroom of history. The Hittite record did not describe a crushing Egyptian victory. It pointed instead toward an inconclusive struggle, heavy pressure on the Egyptian army, and a political reality that Egypt's reliefs tried to hide. Years of tension followed the battle, and eventually, Egypt and the Hittites signed a formal peace treaty. A wall says victory when a king needs glory. A treaty says stalemate when two empires are too tired to pretend. The third wall stands far to the south at Abu Simbel, where Ramesses II carved his temple into a Nubian cliff. The location itself was a statement. This was not the crowded political world of Thebes. This was a frontier of empire, a place where stone, sunlight, and royal scale could remind Nubia that Egypt's king was more than human. Inside the temple, Kadesh appears again. The same battle, the same hero, the same claim of overwhelming power. But when the Abu Simbel version is placed beside the Ramesseum version, the repetition becomes more suspicious than reassuring. The story has not merely been copied, it has been sharpened. Doubt has been reduced. Weakness has been erased. The myth has been given a second, cleaner edition. The changes at Abu Simbel all move in the same direction. Enemy numbers feel larger. Egyptian vulnerability feels smaller. Scenes that suggest defense or confusion give way to images of enemy submission. The king's uncertainty becomes divine certainty. The battle stops looking like a crisis survived by timing and reinforcements, and starts looking like a victory guaranteed before the first arrow flew. That is what makes Abu Simbel so important. It shows propaganda not as a single emotional exaggeration, but as a managed process. A first version is carved. A later version improves the message. The official memory becomes more heroic with distance. The stone does not just preserve the past. It edits the past until the political problem has almost disappeared. Abu Simbel's remoteness made the message stronger. A temple carved into a cliff at the edge of empire could speak with a voice no ordinary person could answer. There were no soldiers from Kadesh standing nearby to correct the scene. No Hittite scribe could interrupt the ritual. No exhausted officer could whisper that the battle had been closer than the king allowed. The farther the story traveled from the battlefield, the cleaner it became. At Abu Simbel, Kadesh was no longer a contested military event. It was a sacred drama arranged around the pharaoh's body, his chariot, and his gods. That is the genius of imperial storytelling. Distance turns memory into monument, and monument turns uncertainty into something that feels eternal. The fourth wall stands at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III on the west bank of Luxor. By this time, the world around Egypt was changing violently. The great Bronze Age powers were weakening. Cities were burning. Trade networks were breaking, and displaced groups were moving across the eastern Mediterranean in ways no palace system could fully control. On the walls, Ramesses III presents himself as the king who stopped the sea peoples and saved Egypt from the fate that swallowed other kingdoms. The naval battle relief is magnificent. Enemy ships collapse into chaos. Egyptian archers dominate the scene. Prisoners are counted. Order triumphs. The wall says Egypt held the line when the world caught fire. The Sea People's crisis was real, and Egypt did survive it. That is what makes the Medinet Habu wall so powerful. It is not a fantasy with no foundation. It records a genuine threat and a genuine defense. But survival is not the same as strength, and the evidence around the temple points toward a state under severe pressure. Administrative records from the late New Kingdom show ration problems, labor unrest, weakening provincial control, and growing economic power in temple estates. The famous strike by tomb workers under Ramesses III shows a system struggling to feed the very men who built the royal afterlife. The wall says Egypt defeated chaos. The papyri say chaos had already entered the bureaucracy. This is the tragedy behind Medinet Habu. The relief shows a civilization defeating invaders at the edge of the Nile. But the wider world that had made Egyptian empire possible was already collapsing. Hittite power fell. Ugarit vanished. Mycenaean palaces burned. Trade routes that once carried bronze, grain, luxury goods, and diplomatic messages became unreliable or disappeared. Egypt did not vanish overnight, and that matters. It survived longer than many neighbors. Yet it survived as something diminished, with weaker reach, poorer systems, and less control beyond its own valley. Medinet Habu, therefore, becomes the final great version of an old habit, a wall declaring permanent triumph, while history quietly reduces the world that made such triumph meaningful. Karnak, the Ramesseum, Abu Simbel, and Medinet Habu were built in different moments, under different kings, for different crises, yet they share one method. Each wall takes a dangerous event and turns it into royal certainty. Each wall removes the hesitation, the cost, the delay, or the partial outcome that would make power look human. This does not mean the walls are useless. It means they must be read like arguments, not mirrors. They preserve what rulers wanted remembered, and that is historically valuable. But the truth appears only when stone is placed beside soil, tablets, papyri, treaties, and the awkward evidence that power did not control. The wall gives the official voice. The ground gives the cross-examination. The Hittite tablets matter because they broke the Egyptian monopoly on Kadesh. The papyri matter because they reveal the stress beneath Medinet Habu's victory. The archaeology of Megiddo and the Levant matters because soil is not loyal to any dynasty. It keeps what falls into it, whether kings approve or not. That is why ancient history is never only about reading what survives. It is about asking why a thing survived, who wanted it preserved, and what other evidence was never invited into the official story. The most powerful sources are often the most carefully staged. The accidental sources are often the ones that let the dead contradict their kings. 4 walls tried to make victory permanent. Karnak turned a complicated campaign into a model of royal dominance. The Ramesseum turned a battlefield crisis into divine heroism. Abu Simbel edited that heroism into an even cleaner myth. Medinet Habu declared that Egypt had defeated chaos while the systems beneath the kingdom were beginning to fracture. The pattern is not ancient only. Every age has its walls. Some are carved in stone. Some are printed in reports. Some are broadcast across screens, and some are repeated until they feel older than memory. The question is always the same. What did power need people to believe? And what evidence did it have to leave outside the frame? That is why these walls still feel modern. They are ancient, but the mechanism is familiar. A ruler survives a crisis, then turns survival into destiny. A costly campaign becomes a perfect victory. A negotiated limit becomes a moral triumph. A frightened court becomes a nation, told to remember only the image that keeps authority intact. The ruins ask us to listen in layers. First to the carved voice, because it tells us what power wanted. Then to the rival archive, because it tells us what power feared. Then to the earth, because it kept the fragments no ceremony could arrange. Only when all three voices speak together does the battle stop being a monument and become history. The miracle is not that the Pharaohs shaped the record. Every empire tries to do that. The miracle is that the record failed to stay alone. Clay survived beside stone. Worker complaints survived beside victory hymns. Burn layers survived beneath palace floors. The ancient world left us propaganda, but it also left us the tools to question it. So, when you look at these temple walls, do not ask only whether the carvings are beautiful. Ask what they are protecting. Ask why the pharaoh is always larger than the crisis, why the enemy is always smaller than the fear, and why the cleanest stories so often appear exactly where the evidence is most complicated. If you stayed with these four walls until the end, leave one comment below. Which wall changed the way you think about ancient propaganda the most? Karnak, the Ramesseum, Abu Simbel, or Medinet Habu? And subscribe, because the ancient world is full of places where the official story is still standing. But the buried truth has not stopped speaking. Listen to the missing parts. That is where this journey begins again. The walls are beautiful, but beauty was never proof that the story was honest. The most important lesson is simple. When a civilization speaks too perfectly about itself, the first duty of the listener is not admiration, but suspicion.